One thing I should mention is, again, how cool it is that Yoda is sharing his data. So one of those last questions that he mentioned about how mutations occur, we've actually used his data in work I won't describe, to use a very simple Polias-Earn model to actually replicate a lot of the patterns, such as shorter phrases appearing later, being more popular, etc. So it's really great that Yura's actually sharing all the data that he described. But what I wanted to talk about today was some of my own difficulties in justifying some of the work I'd done before, which was in exploring social networks online. I found it so very convenient that even before Facebook, individuals were, when they created their homepages, would link to other individuals. So this was more than a decade ago. I was looking at Stanford homepages and who links to whom, and it was great for things like, hey, can we predict who is going to be friends with whom based on the things that they mention on their page? And it turns out it was very easy because homophily exists on the web as well. But then, whenever I presented this work, I would show a picture of my homepage and I would say, hey, do you know how I got to thinking about this? It was because someone had linked to my homepage and said, hey, Lada, I linked to you. How come you're not linking to me? Right? But I didn't give this any further thought. I was just like, well, it's good that there's this peer pressure and therefore we have these networks and we can analyze them. Just in filling out the survey that we were given before coming here, where I had to remember who I had communicated with. This is a little bit awkward because some people will tell you they're horrible at remembering names and others will say they're horrible at remembering faces. Well, I'm horrible at both. And I do remember papers, however. So when I saw Rob Ackland's name, I said, political blogs. And so I actually went into my email client and I typed in the name and I discovered that yes, we had in fact communicated. And then I ran into him waiting for the elevator last night at the hotel and he recognized me and I didn't recognize him, but I was so glad. I said, hey, I added you to my little, I made our connection explicit, and he said, I did too. And we were relieved, right? Because what about the awkwardness if one of us had said, hey, I communicated with you, and the other one hadn't remembered? So this brings us to the main question of this talk, which is how accurate are the social networks that we can observe online given these pressures to reciprocate? And I'm just going to, so, of course, online social networking features are just like a gold mine for us researchers, so I don't want to knock it. I've really benefited from that. They're also very useful for all of these online services that employ them to filter content, to make recommendations, to make their features more attractive. But I'm going to address the question of how one can elicit honest ratings. And I'm going to start with actually not users rating other users, but comparing, what happens if users rate products? What if they don't directly rate other users, but rate other individuals' work? How are things affected and biased? So this is work that's been in a few papers, and one paper that's under review with my collaborators, Edwin Tang and Deborah Lauterbach and Mark Ackerman. So there's a lot of related work, some of it by Yuda, which has focused on trying to predict whether, if you have some sort of valence on a tie, whether individuals are going to be positive or negative about each other based on what others in the network are saying. However, this has taken those ratings that you've collected as truth. So if I say I like you, it actually is treated as I like you, which we're not quite so sure about. There's also been work on relating online social networks and online activities to offline relationships, showing that there is a correlation. However, again, there wasn't really an account of what are the shifts that happen when you're asking individuals to be explicit. And then, there's also been research into anonymity and ratings. I mean, you don't have to do research to figure out that your teaching evaluations are going to be a little bit more blunt and honest if they're anonymous than if they're identified. And the same thing for peer review, right? The experiment with the journal Nature found that people were less willing to offer reviews, and when they did, they were shorter and kind of nicer than what they usually get. So, why do we care about getting accurate ratings of people by people? if you think about it, and first of all, Facebook doesn't ask you to rate your friends, but sometimes you get a friend request from someone you're not that excited about, and you might reciprocate, and there's really no penalty, right? Because at most you're going to see some status updates that you don't care about, and you can say, I don't actually care about them, and then you don't see them anymore. However, for other online social networking services such as Couchsurfing.com, what is at stake is rather higher. So here you go online and you find someone to stay with, a complete stranger, likely in a different country, and lots of people do this, right? And the way that you evaluate is based on what others say about this person. And so this is just the network showing that basically there's lots of exchange between different countries, but only 15% or so are directly reciprocated stays. So I stay with you and you stay with me. The rest is part of this giant component, right? A strongly connected component of generalized reciprocity, where it's not that I stayed with you and so you stayed with me, but I stayed with you and you hosted someone, or I hosted someone who hosted you, right? So this generalized reciprocity is at work. So it's really great. We care that this kind of network can be sustained, and we actually went from analyzing, hundreds of thousands of edges to actually interviewing people, and what they told us was, it's true. It's as if you met someone on a train and you said, hey, come stay at my place. Or there were experiences of individuals who showed up in Brussels, and their host said, hey, here's the key to my house. I have to go to work now. See you later, right? And they'd never met before. So is this all based on ratings that are accurate, or is there something else at play? So imagine that you're rating either an individual or something that they have done, and you think it was only worth 2 stars. This rating can either be kept private in the system, or it can be shown publicly. When it's shown publicly, it can be anonymous so that no one knows that it was you, or it can be identified. It has your name. However, if it's identified, the other person can potentially see this and either rate you or something you did negatively as well, leaving you feeling rather sad. Okay, so here are the data sets that we'll be using. So first of all, Amazon.com, people aren't rating people, they're rating products. ePinions, we have people rating other people's reviews of products. And then ePinions and Couchsurfing, I'll just talk about the Couchsurfing bit, people rating other people directly. Okay, so on Amazon, what we did was we just got the reviews by the 1,500 most active reviewers. Roughly half of them chose to use pen names, so we don't know who they really are. No one knows who they really are. And the rest chose to use their real names. And the question is, if you're using a pen name, are you more likely to give products lower ratings? It turns out this is not the case. The average rating is about the same between the two groups, with the identified groups writing slightly more reviews, slightly longer reviews, and attracting more of a following, so people who want to be notified when they write new reviews. So in this case, there is no reciprocity, right? You rate a product, the product does not rate you back, right? And we find that people are kind of equally honest in both cases. With ePinions, when you're choosing to rate someone else's review, you can choose whether or not to be anonymous. And it turns out that if you're anonymous, your rating tends to be lower. Okay, you might say, well, maybe it's the grumpy people who both give poor ratings and like to stay anonymous, right? But even if we look at the same individual, sometimes they're choosing to rate anonymously and sometimes they're choosing to be identified. When they're anonymous, they'll give lower ratings, right? So in this case, where you do have the potential for reciprocity, that person whose review you said was unhelpful can look up one of your reviews and say it's unhelpful back, right? So we do see a little bit of an effect. And there's also evidence for reciprocity. So the identified reviews, they tend to be correlated across user pairs, but the unidentified ones or the anonymous ones tend to be less correlated. So if you don't know how someone is rating your reviews, you're less likely to respond in kind. Okay, so this brings me to Couchsurfing, which has more faceted ratings, which will make things a little bit more interesting, because here users are not just asked to rate, on a scale of 1 to 5, they're asked to rate friendship and trust separately. And so what factors into rating people in this way, and what are trust and friendship anyway? I think it turns out, as much as this talk is about knocking using web data for inferring kind of social attributes, I'm just going to kind of regress into saying, hey, cool, look at all of these things we can learn about trust and friendship just by looking at online ratings. So that's what I'll do. So here we have 600,000 users and 3 million edges. And we spent about a year analyzing that, and then we said we don't quite get it. So we sent out a survey, and Couchsurfing actually posted the survey for us, and we got 500 responses. And then after that survey, we said we don't quite get it. So we actually, because this is a very unique community, so we actually interviewed 18 subjects. So we went from large-scale data analysis to, how are you feeling today? And it was great. So what users can specify for other users? They can specify the friendship degree, everything from never met to acquaintance to friend, good friend, close friend, best friend. How much they trust them, from not at all to highly or with their life. They can vouch for them, meaning it's just a binary designation, this person is trustworthy, and they can leave positive, neutral, or negative references. And 3 of these, everything except for trust, is shown publicly, so everyone can see how you rated the other individual, but trust is private. Okay, so the first thing I'll talk about are the references. So you have some experience with someone, either you've stayed with them or they stayed with you, or you just hung out together, and you can leave a reference, and something like 90% of the time people do leave references, so it's a very common practice. What is surprising, however, is that there's a near absence of negative references. So the ratio of positive to negative is 2,500 to 1. This is as if you went to Amazon and every product had a 5-star rating, or you went to ePinions and every review was very helpful, right? But you go to Couchsurfing and every experience was, extremely positive. Actually, Couchsurfing did away with the designation extremely positive because just so many people were using it by default that it lost meaning. So now it's just positive, neutral, negative, but you still don't see the negative. So what does this mean? It's really everyone having a great time on Couchsurfing, and for the most part from our interviews, we're finding out that they are. But we find that, 55% of the survey respondents said that they always leave references. But for those who didn't, half said they were too busy, but almost a half said that they'd had a neutral negative experience and just didn't want to express that. Okay, so sometimes there's just this concern for the other's reputation. I didn't have such a good time with this person, but maybe someone else would. Why ruin their chances with other people by giving them a negative reference? But there's also this potential for reciprocity. First of all, some Couchsurfers will wait for the other person to write their reference first and then gauge, especially what is written in the text, and kind of respond in kind. Others will say, the surfer should always rate first before the host does. And there's also this fear of reciprocal action, right? So here's one survey respondent saying, but the big problem is that if you leave a bad reference, what happens then? What will that person say about you? You leave a bad reference and he can do the same, and it's not true, right? So why leave a bad reference when the other person can do the same thing? And then when you ask them, well, why didn't you leave a negative reference? They say, oh, I wish I did because I really had a bad experience with that person, and I don't want anyone else to have this bad experience, and I should have, but I didn't, right? So we're just not seeing the negative ratings at the rate that we should. Okay, so putting that aside, we do have these other ratings that are available. So references are always going to be very positive. Let's see what people do with friendship and trust. So how easy is it to quantify friendship and trust? I mean, you're asking people to quantify something that's inherently subjective. And can you really use one to interpret the other, right? So we had a lot of responses saying, well, friendship includes trust, but maybe you can trust without being very close friends. And in fact, this is what we observe. So, mouse pointer, great. So if you look at the friendship rating from A to B and the trust rating from that same A to B, if A and B are best friends, that trust rating is going to be, very, very high. However, if you look at the highest trust rating, there's actually a whole range of friendship degrees. So you don't have to be very close to someone in order to trust them highly. We also had varying responses about, what takes time. So some people will say, oh, I'll shake someone's hand and I trust them instantly. Or they'll say, oh, well, friendship is the instantaneous one. We'll spend a very fun time together and we'll just be best friends, right? So which is it? And it turns out that both take time, but trust tends to plateau sooner, right? So here's one respondent saying, it'll tend to build, but after a while it just kind of, it peaks, right? So I won't get to trust someone even more. And in general, how long you know someone does not correlate as much with the friendship degree as how well you know them. So the more you know them, the more correlated it is with the friendship and trust that you assign. And then there are just other kind of neat clues. For example, if someone's a good friend, you may be more willing to travel with them, right? As opposed to trust, it doesn't play as much of a role. Then there's the question of, we're treating all of these ratings as edge attributes, right? Whether two people are friends, whether they trust each other. But maybe some of that is actually inherently a property of the nodes. And we're just learning about the node, right, by asking the other nodes around it. So you might think that friendship should be more of an edge attribute and maybe trust should be more of a node attribute because someone's inherently more trustworthy. And in fact, we find this to be the case. So we take the variance per individual in the trust and friendship ratings, and we normalize by the variance of all ratings for individuals who have the same number of friends, just to normalize by, if you have more friends, then more of them will be weak ties. And in fact, we do find that the variance in friendship ratings per individual is higher than the trust ratings. Both of them are lower than 1, which would mean that, there's no property of you that determines how people rate you as a friend or how much they trust you. Okay, so let's return to the question of reciprocity. So if you remember, trust is held privately. And so no one gets to see how you rated them on trust, but friendship is shown publicly. So the person you rated gets to see it, and everyone else gets to see it as well. And we find, in fact, that the trust ratings are less correlated, being private, than the friendship ratings, which the correlation is much higher. And we think, again, that this is due to reciprocity, which was in fact confirmed by some of our interviews. So people mentioned not wanting to be impolite, right? So they don't want to specify a lower friendship level. They're wondering, how did the other person rate them? They just are thinking about the reactions. But what's funny then is that as much as people worry about what will this person think if I rate them as an acquaintance instead of a friend, very few actually ever noticed that the ratings were not aligned, right? And when they did notice, they tend to dismiss it as, it's not a big deal. Maybe it doesn't feel so great that this person whom I rated as a friend only thought that I was an acquaintance, but what really mattered was the experience, not these numbers. And in fact, this turns up when you look at what do people pay attention to when they're deciding whether they want to surf or host someone. So it doesn't matter how many friends you have or how close those friends they say they are to you. What does matter is how many references you have, which is a reflection of your experience within Couchsurfing, and then also the text of the references. So now why the text? Well, one clue is that if 99.9% of the references are positive, then there's not really much signal in the valence of the rating. However, people also figure out how to say this person is not that great while saying they're great, right? So if I go on Couchsurfing and I say, oh, I don't know, Kati, she's a very nice host and she's kind, right? That actually on Couchsurfing might be a bit of a diss. So, and I think this will be a while before we can kind of automatically process this, but humans are very, very adept at it. Okay, so the final thing I wanted to address was just, even if you can elicit ratings truthfully, there might be other biases hidden in here. So There's some gender effects. Now, this might be particular to Couchsurfing, but what we see is that men rate men and women about equally on trust and friendship. If you look at the distribution, there's no difference. However, women tend to rate other women more highly. Okay? Age. So there's this U-shaped curve where you get the highest ratings in your early 20s, and then it kind of starts taking a plunge through your 30s and 40s, and maybe in the 50s it starts coming up again. And at first I thought, well, this is just because most of the Couchsurfing demographic is in their early 20s, and so they'll prefer other people of a similar age, until The Economist published this U-curve from a PNAS article that showed that actually the way that you rate yourself also tends to be a U-curve as a function of age, right? And then I remembered, hey, I teach the statistics class, and we look at the American Time Use Survey, and the number of minutes spent sleeping each day on average, also the same U-shaped curve. So it's not really clear what you need to do to improve your ratings. It may be getting more sleep or just waiting until you're in your 60s, right? Okay, so the final demographic factor is geography. Somewhat unsurprisingly, people tend to rate their own countrymen more highly, or if the countries are of a similar culture. This didn't extend to all countries. So for example, the Canadians didn't like the Americans more than they liked others, but say Germany and Austria tended to rate each other highly. If you look at there might also be some cultural and language differences, because if you look at how people within a country rate each other, that will be similar to how they're rated by others and how they rate others outside of their country. And we picked up a little bit on this with some of the survey respondents saying, who were from Spain, saying, I would trust this person with my life. That doesn't translate into Spanish, and so relatively few people in Spain use the highest trust rating, even though it might just be an artifact of the wording. Okay, and so the final thing is just looking at vouches, and this is a case where it's actually okay to not always reciprocate. And the way that this is introduced is that Couchsurfing is saying you have to take vouching very seriously and only vouch for people who you think are absolutely trustworthy. Plus, not everyone can vouch. So you have to be vouched 3 times before you can start vouching for other people. And so you don't always expect to get vouches. And so in our interviews, the subject said, you know, I don't really feel any pressure to reciprocate, or I'm not expected to vouch. So that was good. And there's also a little bit of signal when you see an unreciprocated vouch, but that person could have reciprocated, the private trust rating actually tends to be lower, right? So there's just in those, you know, references that weren't left and the vouches that weren't given, there's some signal about what the person thinks. Yeah.
You said you can only vouch after you have 3 vouchers.
Mm-hmm.
How did anyone get 3 vouchers before anyone?
Well, I think the you know, kind of Couchsurfing core allowed themselves some vouches initially. Yeah. Okay, so can you predict vouches? I mean, this is of course supposed to be about networks, and so far I've talked about, you know, individual ties. So we just said, okay, we want to predict whether A is going to vouch for B, and we found that it's really easy to do if you take into account the friendship degree that they specified, or, you know, the references that they left, or how they met. But what isn't useful, or isn't as useful, are things that usually work really well when you're doing network analysis. For example, propagating, doing a 2-step propagation. So I'm going to vouch for this person because a lot of my friends have vouched for them. Actually doesn't translate. What does even worse are things like PageRank. You know, I'm going to vouch for this person because a lot of people who are vouched for themselves have vouched for this person. That's as good as, actually we're using a balanced test set. That's about as good as a random guess. Right, so this just brings to, I don't know, just to conclude, this just points out that as fun as it is to do network analysis on kind of a network scale and discover all of these patterns, etc., there's also a lot to be gleaned by looking at the individual ties, looking what we can learn, but also taking into account, you know, the potential biases and errors that are introduced just by actually asking people to be explicit about their feelings. So that's it. And if you want to look at some of these papers, that's my website. Thanks.
So there's obviously a whole lot of literature on trust, in fact, with dozens and dozens of different definitions of what it means, and different communities use it very differently. But one of the things that comes through most of that literature is again and again that the contextualization has huge effect. So when I say, I trust this person, it's very different than if I'm in a film rating site than if I'm in some kind of general site. You know, you reported on very specific results in a very specific context. Have you looked at how that generalizes further and what kinds of trust you're talking about in the more social sense?
I can just say for Couchsurfing, others have looked at what it means to trust, and there's definitely a sense of belonging to the community. Understanding the Couchsurfing ethos, so you're not just out to find a cheap place to stay, but you understand that it's really about making connections with people, etc. So I can just confirm the first part that it is very...
I'm trying to go the other direction then. From what
Yeah.
you've learned on Couchsurfing, do you think you've learned anything general?
I do tend to believe this asymmetry between trust and friendship. So because this is the only data set we have, I can't say, oh, you know, we've looked at 10 other data sets and this bears out, but I do think I expect that to be robust in other contexts.
It strikes me that the 1,500 people who are most popular on Amazon might have a very different usage of pin names than other users of that service. Do you have any information on that, or are you limited only to that data set?
Yeah, we limited it just to that. So why do you think it would be different?
So people that are that popular, especially at the very top, are probably have much more fame with their pseudonym than they do with their real name. So their reputation within the Amazon community, especially if you really believe the various Amazon conspiracy theorists about the top ranked people being like actually teams of people and paying compensation and things like that. So it seems to me like they would have very different motivations for protecting their pseudonym as opposed to someone who only used their account once or twice and may be using less pro-social, basically spamming and things like that.
So that's good to know.
Are people hungry? Food for thought. Clearly, the president I told you
Have you tried to do some modeling? Oh. So are you saying that I'm not loud enough? Have you tried to use some modeling about in which you say define some mechanism for people to use the ratings or to assign trust and see how, you know, thinking about a few types of mechanisms, right? That if you are going to give a rate, you always give highest or second highest. And absence, anything less means that you are not going to be rating. And if you also have information about who stayed with whom, you potentially could build a model and make some predictions about what you would expect to observe. Have you tried that and see to what extent some of these things are surprising, or to what extent absence of information can be read as an actual evaluation?
Yeah, we haven't dealt, I guess, more deeply into it. We have looked a little bit at updates. You know, if a rating is changed, what is likely to happen, and whether that bears out with some of these assumptions about individuals wanting to match. And it is, It's either that both individuals will update to higher at the same time, or if there's a discrepancy that the person who had lower will catch up. But it's just been kind of limited to that.
Thank you. Well, this concludes this session. So thank you.